And this is where we kick it off. AmaZulu King Misuzulu KaZwelithini is at Kingsmead Stadium in Durban after taking part in a walk to raise awareness about the scourge of gender-based violence. Our reporter Linda Mnisi is there and joins us now. Linda, good afternoon. Great to catch up with you. Now, what is the message that came from the King after that walk this morning?
Well, important messages coming out of the AmaZulu King Misuzulu KaZwelithini, touching on a number of issues, but starting really, Hugo, from his inaugural speech, where he made the commitment and the pledge to fight against gender-based violence, but most importantly, bringing men into this conversation. He spoke about that, and that today is the day that he honors that pledge that he made in front of the thousands of people that gathered, during that traditional ceremony, as well as the certificate handover ceremony. You'll remember this is something that he's spoken about even as far back as the annual reed dance. The first leg of the reed dance, we heard him speak about, bringing men into the conversation, as well as working together with the foundation of Queen Ngamaisela, who is his wife, in making sure that they bring in men into this conversation. He speaks about, from a personal point of view, saying that he stands in front of the people who came here as not only a king, but also as a father to 2 boys and 3 girls, and that this is something that is important to him because he needs to model, his kids into becoming what, of course, is expected in today's society, but also speaking about one of the important issues, Hugo, that we often heard, from gender activists, things that we've heard during even the GBV summit that just took place in early November, around resources and how those resources, often do not get to people in remote areas, in rural areas. You'll remember, that he is ruling particularly in a province that, still upholds traditional customs as well as practices, which then makes it even more harder, for those who are in remote areas, saying that even traditional practices need to also be looked at so that they are not, an option for perpetrators of gender-based violence. He encourages funders. The issue of funding is also one that is very important, encouraging funders to come close and come together and encourage competition amongst themselves in terms of what it is that they do, what it is that they bring to the table in this fight against gender-based violence. He touches on the figures and he says, because KZN is leading in terms of the statistics, it means that they've got a lot of work that needs to be done. They've got a lot of work that they need to do. Therefore, coming together, what that brings, rather, it extends the impact to other areas that would not necessarily reach these, resources. So he says he's extending his invite to all the donors, every person in the private sector, government sector, as well as civil society, to come together, because it is through collaboration that they can cast the net wider and protect the vulnerable.
Well, Linda, it would obviously seem from the King's address that there is a political will of sorts, if you will. Now, I know you took part in that walk this morning. What was the mood in the camp, for want of a better description? Those attendees, did you have a chance to speak to them? Are they feeling the message that the King finally gave? Are they likely to support these various initiatives?
Well, you speak about political will, Hugo, and, from what we heard earlier on from the organizers of this march, it seemed as though, the provincial government in particular had dropped the ball in terms of mobilizing people to come and fill the stadium. This address by the King happened in the presidential suite of the stadium, because if you look to my right, this is where everybody was meant to fill. These are the grounds that were meant to be filled by those who would have come to listen to the King's speech. But, the mobilization did not quite happen, and the organizers say it is, of course, placing the blame right at the door of the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal. But nonetheless, the King addressing those who gathered at this, presidential suite. They seem to have filled the presidential suite itself to listen to the important message of the King. But we also heard from the Social Development Minister, Linda Mnisi, who spoke about the importance of leaders coming to the party and making sure that, all resources are driven to where they're mostly needed. But just after the program started, we saw the entrance of the former executive director of UN Women, Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka, who came in and addressed those who gathered here about important and critical points. Hugo, saying that gender-based violence often happens in areas or in countries, most importantly, where there are traditional leaders and where things like religion and a belief system is mostly, a thing that is carried out throughout the country, and saying that because, in traditional settings, cultural norms would sometimes be used to abuse women and children, and particularly those who are vulnerable. Now, she was giving a global point of view, when it comes to the issue of gender-based violence, also highlighting how South Africa's GBV problem is above global average, which means that, like the King said, there is a lot of work that needs to be done. She went as far as quoting the former president, Nelson Mandela, the late statesman, saying that one of the things that he used to say was that if men don't play their part in fighting against women's liberation, then they're part of the conspiracy. They're now bringing in the participation of men, and also how we live on our day-to-day lives, and making sure that even the simplest things as a joke, if it is a sexist joke or a homophobic joke, then it really needs to be called out, because it is there where people think it's okay to victimize people who are vulnerable and people from vulnerable groups. So we heard important messages there, but also we heard from a gender-based violence victim who really shared her story, importantly in front of the police commissioner here in KwaZulu-Natal, who detailed how she worked at the Durban Central Police Station and how she was attacked one Sunday when she was on duty. In fact, she was signing off duty and she was attacked. She said till today she hasn't been able to receive the kind of assistance that a victim would need to get. So it also then speaks about gender-based violence and where it happens, which is something that Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka pointed out, that it happens everywhere, even in police stations, at workplaces, and even in religious and traditional settings. Hugo?
Linda, before we wrap this up, you talk about calling people out. Now, King Misuzulu KaZwelithini called out those who do not stop gender-based violence, and he said that they're as bad as the perpetrators themselves. But talk to us about the plan. What is that? Is there an indication of a roll-up plan of how the fight of GBV is going to be mapped out in KZN?
Well, at this point, from this ceremony and this event, Hugo, there wasn't a detailed plan in terms of how the King plans to bridge the gap, especially when you look at, the promises as well as the implementation. There seems to be a vast gap between those. But what the King spoke about at length is how, first, collaboration is important, so that when these plans are drawn out and how to tackle them, then they speak directly to the issue. And it's in fact something that Dr. Phumzile Mlambo-Ngcuka pointed out, saying that each country has its own unique problems and its own unique challenges where gender-based violence is concerned. It is in every country, but we have unique challenges in the sense that in other areas, for example, KwaZulu-Natal, in South Africa, you'd find traditional leaders, you'd find, religious leaders, and which often has a role and an impact in gender-based violence. How then do you bring them together in the fight against gender-based violence? So the King has not necessarily laid out his plan in terms of what they plan to do, but it's quite clear that one of the foundations that was here, Gamaskolo, which is the one that collaborated with the Good Men's Foundation. In fact, that foundation is the foundation of the Queen, Untokozo Maisela. That is the Queen, the wife of King Misuzulu KaZwelithini, saying that he's quite grateful that there are quite a number of people that are coming to work with this foundation, because it did make its intentions clear that it would take up this matter and it would make sure that young girls and young women, in fact also young men, are also included in the fight against gender-based violence, because these are future leaders in the country who also need to act in a manner that will benefit society tomorrow.
Your time this afternoon. Our reporter Linda Mnisi coming to us from Kingsmead Stadium on the back of that GBV march in which King Misuzulu KaZwelithini took part, and calling out those that do not fight the GBV, and he's saying that they're as bad as the perpetrators themselves.